We have in studio today filmmaker Tim Mahoney and Egyptologist David Rohl to talk about the film Patterns of Evidence. It's a film dedicated to demonstrating the historicity of the biblical events depicted in Genesis and Exodus. And so we have a lot to talk about with regard to the making of the film and its impact and perhaps future projects as well. So welcome, Tim and David, to our program.
Good to be here.
Let me just ask you how this came about. How did you get involved in this project, and how does it relate to your previous experience and interests?
Well, I'm a filmmaker, and I always wanted to be a filmmaker. I was a filmmaker wannabe, too. And so you're always looking for something, a project. And earlier in my career, I actually grew up in this area, the Twin Cities, and I heard about a filmmaking school, and I was going to actually 2 years of a Bible school. I was just taking general college there. And when I heard about this other school, I transitioned, to that to become I thought, wow, the idea of being a filmmaker would have been, was a fantastic idea. It had never entered my mind before. And so that began 40 years ago. And it was a long journey in the last 40 years of trying to learn how to make films. And I started by making TV commercials. So I've made a lot of TV commercials, a lot of videos, and then I made other documentaries. I actually worked with Worldwide Pictures. When they would make a movie, I would go to the location and film the behind-the-scenes TV special. It was like a half-hour documentary of what the film was about. And then I made commercials from that, and I made other media materials.
Worldwide Pictures being the Billy Graham filmmaking arm.
Yes, yeah. I did 4 of those types of doc TV specials. And that led me on to making other types of programs. I made another one with Don Byerly. I don't know if you've heard of him, Dr. Don Byerly, and it was Jesus, Divine, or Da Vinci. Who is Jesus? Is he divine or is he Da Vinci? And so we made those kinds of, and that was a national TV special. So that was sort of my interest. And in the meantime, I was just doing regular, as you call it, tent-making work, doing commercials, working with corporate America and videos. And I heard about this story of the Exodus being investigated, and that started my interest about 13 years ago. And that's how long I've been at this particular project, for about 13 years now. And going to the Middle East was part of that. And I went there. And it was amazing and difficult, very difficult. It was just after 9/11. So when I got there, we got to the locations where the events were to have happened, I went to an Egyptologist, Dr. Manfred Bitek, and I said, so have you found evidence of the Israelites in Egypt? Because he was right in the right location, what the Bible calls the land of Goshen, which is the eastern part of the Delta. Correct. And David, this is before I knew David, but he knew this professor as well. And he's a brilliant, brilliant, world-leading Egyptologist. And so when I asked him the question, have you found evidence for the Exodus, for the Israelites? He said, so far, not. And I was stunned because I thought, what are you talking about? I mean, I had every thought that he was going to say, yes, they're here, and, we're uncovering this stuff, but he basically told me there wasn't any evidence. And I don't know if you want to speak to...
Well, the fact of the matter is that he was excavating a fantastically big city. 30,000 people lived in this city, and they were all Semites. They were all people from Canaan, not Egyptians. And yet he couldn't identify them as the Israelites because they were out of time with his expectations of where the Israelites should be. He always considered the Israelites to be in the time of Ramesses II because of the first chapter in the book of Exodus where it mentions the building of the store city of Ramses. And so most scholars have attributed that name Ramses to Ramesses II and therefore have placed Moses, as in the Cecil B. DeMille movie, at the time of Ramesses. And so he was digging this fantastic city of Semites, this huge city, but it was in the wrong time period. It was too early for them to be the Israelites. So he didn't recognize what he was excavating as the city of the Israelites in Goshen.
And so the city of Ramesses was up here, which he thought the biblical time, and down below was this other city.
Called Avaris. The name of the city is Avaris. And it belongs to the Middle Bronze Age, whereas the city of Ramesses belongs to the Late Bronze Age. So this time shift, this difference in time, is why most scholars have failed to recognize any evidence for the biblical stories and narratives in the archaeology of Egypt, because when they look at the city of Ramses, there are no Semites there. They've got no archaeology of Semites, no burials, no houses, no pottery that you'd recognize as being Semitic as opposed to Egyptian. Dig a little bit lower down, and you find this massive city which is full of Semitic graves, full of Semitic pottery, and it's the obvious story of the Bible. When you check the archaeological evidence, it fits beautifully with the Sojourn period.
Now, this represented, at least in your own admission on the film, a bit of a crisis of faith for you.
It did, yes.
And so what was that? How did that play into the making of the film then?
Well, what happened, very, very good question. What ended up happening for me was I didn't tell anyone, but it started to really affect me. I don't know if you've ever had a question or something that happens in your own life. And I was sitting in the edit suite because I would work on the films during the weekend sometimes because I had more time. And I was sitting there on a Saturday and I was looking at this footage and I was playing Manfred Bitek. And I just, the thought came to me as I heard him say, I asked him the question, is there evidence? And he said, so far not. And I watched that scene several times. And then this thought came into my mind. Maybe everything that you've believed, everything that your family believed, that everything you've been told has been a lie. And it just dawned on me, what if none of this is true? The Bible is not true. Because this event of the Exodus is foundational. I mean, it's talked about through all the other books. And Jesus talked about Moses and the apostles and the apostle Paul. So they're all referencing something. And if it didn't happen, then it's a house of cards. And at that moment, while I had that thought, another thought came into my mind, and that was to stop editing, to get up. I didn't know, you just stop it and get up, go to your office. So I just went to my office and had this impression that I should go to my bookcase. And when I went to my bookcase, I saw this book, and it was Pharaohs and Kings. And I had never read it. A friend of mine from the Twin Cities here gave it to me and said, I think you should have this book, about a year and a half earlier. And it just sat there. And I pulled it out, and I opened it up, and it was a book that David Rohl had written. I didn't know who David Rohl was. All I know is he had a lot of great information, pictures, and I found the very site that BTEC had been that I had been at. David Rohl was reinterpreting what this evidence really was.
That's right.
Well, David, maybe we can ask you at this point your own background and journey to becoming an Egyptologist. If the information that's out on the internet about you is even semi-correct, you have a rather eclectic background.
That's very true.
And so perhaps you can tell us how you arrived at the point where you and Tim began to think about collaborating.
It starts a long time ago.
That's right.
I was writing the names of the Egyptian pharaohs in hieroglyphs when I was 7 years old. Great big sheet of paper with all the different dynasties and all the kings' names on, even almost when I could only just start to really write properly. And then I went to Egypt for the first time when I was 9 years old and sailed in King Farouk's paddle steam all the way from Cairo to Abu Simbel. So my introduction to Egypt was at a very, very early age. I don't know why. I have no idea what motivated me to want to go to Egypt at that age, but I did. I was the youngest member of the Egypt Exploration Society in England, which is the biggest organisation for Egyptology in the country. And so I was full of all this Egyptian stuff when I was a kid, and then I then migrated into the rock business because in the 60s, because I was born in 1950, so I'm sort of in my teen years when the Beatles were coming along. And I got involved in that, and I became a record producer, a sound engineer, and I worked in that industry for about 25 years. And then eventually, sort of in my 30s, I got to the stage where I'd earned enough money to be able to give it up, because to be honest with you, it's an exhausting profession to be in. You're listening to high-pressure music all day long in the studios. It's not healthy. And I went back to university to study ancient Egypt and ancient history and Mycenaean archaeology and Levantine archaeology and Greek history, all within these degree courses at University College London. So I'm a trained Egyptologist. I've been through the whole business. And it was at those times, in that era, sort of like in the 1970s, that I began to realise that there was something wrong with Egyptian dating systems, that scholars had constructed a history of the past which was overextended. And this had nothing to do with the Bible at all. I was just digging into the Egyptian timeline, working out where the anomalies were. And I concluded that scholars had constructed a history that was too long. That if they've extended the historical period back too far, so Ramesses II, for instance, is usually dated about 1279 BC, was about 300 years earlier than he should have been. He should have been closer to the present by 300 years. And you then have to look at the consequences. That was my PhD work that I was doing. So then I looked at the consequences of that for the neighbours of Egypt. And of course, who is the nearest neighbour to Egypt? Israel. So with that 300-year revision in the timeline of Egypt, suddenly everything began to synchronize. Whereas our Bible history was here and our Egyptian history was there and there was no connection. When the Egyptian history was lowered, it then fitted together like a glove, a hand in a glove. So now all of a sudden we see the correct pharaohs for the time of Moses. We see the correct pharaoh for Joseph and the famine. We see the relationship between the United Monarchy period in ancient Egypt and the pharaohs of that time. So the whole thing seemed to fit beautifully. And I wrote all that in Pharaohs and Kings, this book that Tim mentioned. But then Tim was concentrating on the Exodus story. So
well, and the other thing that you might say is that he started giving lectures at the University College London.
That part of the story.
And people came to them, and it was a big deal. And the BBC came, and they said, "Hey, we really like this. Why don't you go ahead and make a TV series?"
That's right, and the book contract came with that as well. So in the UK and in Europe, this theory is quite well established, but over in America it's not. It hasn't been so well established here. So we're in a situation where we're almost bringing this thing to America now, whereas it sort of missed out the first time round in the 1990s. And that's where Tim comes in, because Tim then got in touch with me when he read the book and said, "I need to interview you." So he flew over to the UK, where I was living at the time, and we had a day-long interview, didn't we? Yes. Which is where you take over.
Right. Well, I ended up coming to David, and I spent I actually went to England, and you lived in the south of England at that time.
Okay.
Yeah. And so that's how we first met, and we didn't actually talk with each other much after that for probably 5 or 6 years, because I went off and I was working on the route of the Exodus. But what happened was that people said to me, "Well, why are you searching for the route of the Exodus when there is no evidence that they existed in the first place?" And so we put the route of the Exodus investigation on the back burner. And we basically then focused, and I took what David's interview had been, I called him back and we refilmed, and we ended up developing a whole other film in front of this one that we were working on. And that's what the last 3.5 years has been about.